Welcome to Engaging and Empowering School Libraries, a podcast that aims to raise the profile of school libraries by talking about topics that are current across education and teaching. Today, Daryl and I are continuing our monthly chat, FOSIL Education and School Libraries. We hope to help you engage with the content on the FOSIL Group website, introduce you to people who are using FOSIL in schools, and most of all, just have a conversation about the role of school librarians within education. Thanks for joining me again, Daryl. I hope you're well.
Yes, good, and you?
So this is a part two. Last time we talked about the history of school libraries from 1937 to 1986. So today we're going to continue that conversation and take us up to the modern day. I think this is going to be a really interesting episode and things that I'm going to learn lots on the way. So what are we going to start off with, Daryl? Where are we? So we're in 1986. What's happening?
So just very, very quickly to remind ourselves that we're looking at Norman Beswick's article, The Pastor's Prologue, 2 Decades of Mischances, which he wrote in 1986. And he started by saying that it's heartbreaking to recall that in 1970, it was possible to be very hopeful that a great new age of British school librarianship was about to dawn. And then we got to 1986, where he is lamenting the fact that that hasn't happened. And that although there were significant budget cuts to the education system, which school libraries suffered more than their fair share of, he was very emphatic that budget cuts couldn't solely be blamed for the situation that school librarians found themselves in.
Yeah.
So he said there were he had 2 reasons for hope in 1986, which is what we were going to pick up on today. So 2 reasons for hope. The first one is that he said that microcomputers, so the introduction of microcomputers into schools, reminded us that we lived in an information society, and that skills of retrieving and processing data are central to those of an educated person. And then he said that the information skills movement, as he called it, united with concerns of those already teaching study skills.
Okay.
And then what was actually very interesting is he says that so in 1985, so one of the consequences of this was the development of Anne Irving's groundbreaking and influential 9-question steps model in 1985, which he says came from and has enabled a collaborative discussion between teachers as framers of educational goals and librarians as perceptive participants in the achievement of those educational goals.
Okay.
Now, it is very interesting, just because we both spoke at the San Jose High School Leap into the Future of School Libraries Conference.
We did, yep.
So we did our presentation with Barbara Stripling and David Lurcher, who is a towering figure in the field of school librarianship, who was actually Barbara Stripling's professor when she did school librarianship at San Jose State University.
Okay.
Wrote to us to say how pleased he was that we were carrying on in our work, we're carrying on the tradition of innovation in school librarianship that in many ways started with Anne Irving. So this model, this 9 steps model that she created.
So was the 9 steps model the first of the inquiry frameworks that
well, so
well
now, yes, so this is quite interesting because when I was doing work on this a couple of years ago, Anne's model is one of the very earliest models. Now, Norman Beswick in this article calls it an inquiry model. But David Lurcher called it an information literacy model.
Okay.
Now, I know there are many people who don't make a distinction between an information literacy model and an inquiry model.
But there are many that do.
Yes, and I think it is very telling because two of the most influential and enduring models of the inquiry process, guided inquiry design, that grew out of Carol Coulthard's work, and the Empire State Information Fluency Continuum, and FOSIL, which grew out of Barbara Stripling's work. Both of them are absolutely clear that there is a difference, and that difference is actually vitally important.
Right.
So ahead of today's meeting, I went back to have a look at Anne's model.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, the central focus of the model on information and the use of information makes it an information literacy rather than an inquiry model.
Okay, fair enough.
And I think that has important consequences, which we're still dealing with today.
Okay.
And I think the main issue there is that in inquiry and the model of the inquiry process, the central concern is with learning.
Right.
So it's the process of learning from information. There's stuff that happens before the information, and there's stuff that happens after the information.
Okay.
Whereas the information literacy models have a narrower focus on the
More
information
skills.
need
Yeah.
and the information itself.
Right.
And a consequence of that, in my opinion, is that it makes information literacy and information skills, it makes them very important, and they are highly desirable, but they are not integral to the educational process. And as a consequence, we need to compete with classroom colleagues for curriculum time to teach these information literacy skills, which in the normal day-to-day teaching of subject content may be highly desirable, but isn't essential.
No. Yeah.
And then I think a second consequence of that is, because we're competing for curriculum time and it's practically impossible to get it.
Yeah.
I don't think we have effectively demonstrated how we can teach those skills well. So even if we're just focusing on information literacy and not the learning process as a whole, which includes, or the inquiry process as a whole, which includes information literacy, We haven't even been able to teach those skills effectively that we sell ourselves on.
Yeah. But then that goes back to the fact that school librarians have, even those with a qualification, haven't been trained on how to teach those skills. They've been trained on learning about library management and libraries publications and diversity and all of that, but actually learning the skills of research and learning is
Yeah.
something that they've done as a student doing it, not as a person teaching it. So we have a real problem, because at that point, well, like even now, so I'm already up to date. Even that's the foundation of the problem, isn't it? Is the fact that there isn't an easy way for us to go, actually, this is what we're trained in. This is what we know as a group of professionals, that this is what we should be teaching. So that is a problem in itself, isn't it?
Yes, so you'll see as we come to the end of Beswick's article,
Mm,
the challenges that he identifies. So
yeah,
if these reasons for hope are actually to result in something real,
yeah,
that hope is to become real, there are a number of challenges, and one of those is what you've just touched on. So we'll come back to that before the end of the discussion.
yeah. Okay.
But I think it is just worth pointing out that what was a reason for hope, the introduction of the microcomputer and everything that came after that, I think has actually become a challenge that, unless there is a dramatic change, we will not be able to address. So if you even just take, with the limited opportunities that we've been able to carve out for ourselves
Yeah.
for information literacy in the curriculum, I don't think we can honestly say that we've even taught students how, for example, we had already taught students how to use something like a search engine
Right.
intelligently and effectively, and to be able to work with the results of the search engine and to integrate that into their work, which then also leads, so the evaluation of sources, and then the integration of those sources into their own work and referencing that properly. So we haven't even managed
I
that.
haven't even done that. But that's interesting, because you see, I remember my children being at school when the internet came, and it being because at the time I wasn't working in libraries, and I was very conscious of the fact that the school library wasn't something that was deemed as important now that we had the internet. And my children were told to come home and click, and that was to go and get the answer. And being the librarian in me, I had my encyclopedias that they were made to look at first. But if that was just happening in my small world at that point, it was happening across all schools, and all libraries were becoming less important, because the value at that point was the books, because you couldn't get information anywhere else. So if you wanted to find out about dinosaurs, you had to go to the library and find a book on it and read it. We've transitioned to a computer in the school that you just type in what is a dinosaur and it pops up. So what you're saying is that we as librarians didn't transition to be able to students at that point to be able to get the information effectively. So it was almost like we took a back step. We weren't positioned in the right way at that point to be able to go, actually, we've got some skills that we can help with. Some of that might have been fear. That might have been, this is a new thing like AI is now. Do you think that that was possibly, how did it was quite disjointed then at that point, wasn't it?
I think it's a deeper problem. So the
Right.
problem
Okay.
is it was never about the information.
Okay.
It was always about learning from information.
Yeah.
We made the focus, I think, on information.
Okay.
So
So if
when
yeah.
information is scarce and people need information, and the only place they can get the information is in the books,
Yeah.
and we can show them where to
How?
find the information in the books,
Yeah.
that's great. All of a sudden, um, information is available from other places.
Yeah.
So I don't. So there, I don't think that the reason why, personally, I think the reason why we weren't able to make that transition was because we were focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
If we'd been focused on the learning from information, wherever that information comes from, and there are new ways of finding information,
Yes.
of course we would be teaching that.
Using the
Just
internet.
one
Yes.
more
Yes.
in the learning.
Yes.
But I don't think the focus was the learning, and that is what came out very strongly in the first part of Norman Beswick's history.
Mm.
Is the and we'll come back to that again, is the overwhelming emphasis on recreational reading, and the extent then to which teachers don't view the library as relevant to what they're doing.
Yeah.
So I think it's a double problem. And then so that the microcomputers in 1985 remind us that we live in an information, and then I think there's this real push for librarians to be able to assist with these information skills and these electronic information skills, these digital information skills. But because that is something that sits outside of the learning process, we don't have opportunities to collaborate with teachers to teach those skills effectively within a learning process. And as a consequence, we can't demonstrate, even if that is just our focus, the information skills, we haven't even been able to demonstrate what we're able to do
No.
with that. And then I think AI, so that just massively, massively complicates and aggravates that situation. Because where we still had a hope maybe of, we always used to joke about Google, Wikipedia, copy paste.
Yeah.
So you type your question into Google, and Google gives you the answer to your question.
Yeah.
And our great hope was that if we framed the question in a certain way, then Google couldn't just give you,
Yeah.
couldn't give you the answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So AI blows that out of the water.
Yeah, it does.
And if we couldn't find curriculum time to teach these information skills systematically and progressively as children progress through school, if we couldn't find time to do that for something as relatively straightforward and as slowly developing as search,
Yeah.
AI, well,
Yeah.
what hope do we have?
Yeah.
So that's another discussion.
Yeah.
But we will actually touch on some of that later on. But that's another discussion. But I think this reason for hope in 1986, I think possibly has become a cause for great concern.
Okay.
The second reason for hope is he said that the move to recognizing teaching and library implications for a multicultural society, which is not served by a narrowly didactic approach to teaching. So we spoke a little bit about that last week, is that what is the purpose of school? What is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of the library? And that it's not just about intellectual, academic, cognitive learning. It's not just about memorization and reproduction in tests. It's bigger than that.
Yeah.
And that libraries have always and will continue to have an important role to play there.
Yeah.
And that, it might be worth just reminding people, is the topic in the FOSIL Group Forum on the portraits of an engaged and empowered inquirer. So it might be worth just popping that link into the notes, because the whole point of that is that inquiry as an approach to learning develops attributes, and those attributes are independent learning, strong self-identity, social and emotional, cultural responsiveness, voice and agency of student, and a growth mindset. So inquiry not only is aimed at learning subject content, it also develops these other attributes.
It's really interesting, actually, because I'm doing a training session next week on how the school librarian can link with an Ofsted inspection, and I've been looking at the curriculum and exactly what you've just said. There's a section on a student's personal development. And all of those skills, that all of those attributes that you've just mentioned are in there. And actually that's what we as school librarians should be doing, is that helping schools recognize the value and the link that we bring to those kind of documents. So, it's not just an Ofsted inspection, it's the national curriculum, it's all of that. And actually there's a bit of that, isn't it, that it goes back to purpose again, doesn't it? That we seem to, as school librarians, find ourselves in a school library and then don't know what we're supposed to be doing apart from what we feel we should be doing. And actually, if the purpose is linking to your school's aims and objectives and linking to the national curriculum, then you've automatically got a purposeful link for what you should be doing in helping learners. So I think that it's a broader picture, isn't it, that we need to begin to recognize that actually FOSIL helps to bridge that gap and that conversation, because the conversation is already going on in the FOSIL group website forum, and actually if you can get your head around it, it'll all begin to make a bit more sense.
Yeah, and you'll see, so writing in 1986, you will see some of the things that we've just said now that Norman Beswick highlights and urges. And what I would really encourage anybody who listens to this to do is to go to look at that topic, because I think one of the truly extraordinary things that Barbara and her team did when they developed the portraits. And actually, interestingly, those were digital lead librarians in New York State. Actually, I think it was New York City. They were digital lead librarians. So school librarians who had a specific responsibility for, well, I mean, they called it digital fluency. But so there's a portrait for each transition year. So year 2, sorry,
can you give me, so when we're talking about portraits, when we're looking at how a student should develop over a key stage, and how what they look like. I don't know whether you've got access to an example of what is involved in a portrait of a student.
well, so say for example, there's a portrait. So those 6 attributes that we've just mentioned.
Okay.
So there's a portrait of what. So if you are developing the skills associated with those attributes, if you're developing those systematically and progressively, the portrait is a description of what a child at year 3, year 6, year 9, and year 13 looks like. It's a description of a child at that point in their development as an engaged and empowered inquirer. So, for example, for year 3, independent learning competencies, I set goals for my learning. I use resources to find facts and understand the difference between fact and opinion.
Yeah.
By year 6, I ask questions of value to myself and my community. I gather, evaluate, and interpret information to answer my questions.
Yeah.
So if a child in year 6 were actually able to say that about that attribute, then we know that we have taught them that. Now, the real value, well, that we've taught them that, and that they can do that, if they can demonstrate that they can do that. Now, can you imagine if you had a child in year 6 who was able to honestly say that they could do that and could?
Yeah.
But the thing that's really important is that, so if you go and look at those portrait attributes, is Barbara and her team then identified priority skills for each of those attributes for each of the stages in the inquiry process.
Yeah.
So we are able to say, these are the actual concrete skills that enable us to say that if you design and support an inquiry well, you are developing the skills that develop each of these attributes in ways that we can demonstrate. We can demonstrate them because for each of those priority skills, there are associated graphic organizers.
Yeah. Okay.
That serve instructional and assessment purposes. So those are not grand statements that we've dreamt up to describe an ideal child.
No.
They are age-appropriate skills that have been identified by colleagues who work with students at those ages and who teach students those skills that enable them to develop in those ways.
Okay, so we've jumped ahead again.
Yes.
It's too tempting, isn't it? So let's take us back to where we were. We were talking about the retention process and data. So the second thing from
yes.
Norman
So that is basically it.
So that's what he wanted. What
Yeah.
he wanted is what we have.
Yes. So
Yes.
okay. The thing that learning is not a narrow
tick box skill.
It involves the entire child, and it involves the entire community of children. and the portraits describe the attributes of the whole child as they are developing so that is an example of where we have actually made progress in making this reason for hope a real reason for hope.
Okay. But that hasn't happened everywhere then.
No. And you'll see as we finish off the article now, because we're in the end point of the article. Not everybody agrees that ought to be the purpose of. I think on some level, everybody would say, obviously, yes, the whole child. But in terms of what they actually do in the classroom, aren't necessarily working towards that in the way that other people are.
Yes.
But that comes out of the conclusion that we're going to look at now.
Okay, let's move on then.
So he says, as we have seen, the various roles which the school library can adopt, so we've got a choice to make, are unclear to teachers, and because they're unclear to us, and in general relate to a particular view of education that is held by competing educational philosophies.
Right.
So he says a major problem then facing school librarians is the extent to which school libraries had identified themselves or defined themselves in recreational terms. So a major obstacle in changing teachers' views of what role the library can play in education depends on a particular view of education, which is the outworking of a philosophy of education. So what makes that even more difficult is, he says, the extent to which school libraries had identified themselves in recreational terms, and to the extent that they had, so this is 1986, had defined themselves in recreational terms, to that extent they were most vulnerable to budget cuts.
So the fact that we had originally set our sights on recreational reading and didn't transition when it was important, that understanding of what school libraries are has stayed, hasn't it?
Yes. So the interesting thing that he was saying is in 1986 is that the schools that were most vulnerable to budget cuts were schools that had most fully defined themselves in recreational terms.
Okay.
Then he said, so he said, then the promotion of school libraries is actually the promotion of a particular view of education. So if we are wanting to promote school libraries, we are needing to promote a certain view of education, because there are competing approaches to education, there are competing views of education, there are competing philosophies. Now, a school library is peripheral and possibly even irrelevant to a certain view and philosophy of education. And it's absolutely essential and integral to a different view of education. So we can't promote school libraries effectively without being clear about what our philosophy of education is. what
Yeah.
our approach, our view of education is, what our approach to education is. And that takes us back to what we were saying earlier, is that is and always should have been our major concern.
Yeah.
Is an educational concern. It's a concern with learning and a certain approach to learning that makes us essential and integral.
So how do we then move from what it was in 86 up today?
So he's still so maybe if I just read, because I can't summarize some of what he said and I can't say it better.
No, okay, fair enough.
If I just read
Yeah,
the conclusion of his article,
absolutely.
and then we can unpick it. So so we have argued elsewhere that the promotion of school libraries is the promotion of a particular view of education. I would argue that is inquiry, properly understood. And to get such a view established, it is quite insufficient to produce quantitative standards calling for expensive staffing and resources. To do this, the education library profession as a whole should seek to develop a thorough and sympathetic understanding of educational concerns, the trends, difficulties, and philosophies of education as they relate to the needs of particular types of teacher and particular levels of teaching. Through that understanding, we should be ready to discern ways in which the school library and school library service can support teaching aspirations and amplify the range of possibility. And then he says that teachers will need help with this different approach to education. So he says, a knowledgeable librarian, well read in the literature, who has imaginatively thought into the problems of teacher colleagues and classroom experience, may possibly be able to help maintain the morale of teachers as they view what they are doing in the classroom differently. And I suspect it is more important to do this than to demonstrate a daunting superiority in electronic information retrieval.
Interesting.
And then the last bit, he says, this, of course, underlines the importance of getting key people into posts, but simply establishing the people without giving them the educational, administrative, and resource support to carry out their evangelizing task will be counterproductive. A shy mouse on term time only, sometimes part-time basis, all too often leads to the library image being blurred rather than sharpened. And unless we do this, unless we do this, the divide will remain, and the educators we hope to serve will be unready for and unconvinced of the usefulness of the services we can bring them. I believe that where we failed in 1970 and in subsequent years was to perceive sufficiently seriously the importance of a close interaction with the concerns of the education service, the perceived and latent needs of teachers, and the urgency of close dialogue. We must do more than just ride along on the new fashions as they arrive, just as we must do more than grouse together in local groups about how much we are misunderstood.
Wow, that could be written today, couldn't it?
Yes. Which is why I actually wrote an article which was effectively the pastor's prologue. Yeah, well, basically it was this again 40 years
Yeah,
later
yeah, yeah.
of missed
Missed
opportunities.
opportunities. So what then happened? So we're in 1986. The internet's come in. There's an understanding that there's an importance for information literacy, probably rather than inquiry at that
Yep.
point.
Well, certainly in the UK,
Yeah.
because I think there is a divergence internationally.
Okay.
If you look at guidelines, there's a divergence internationally. So if you look at the first edition of the IFLA School Library Guidelines, which, if I remember correctly, is 2002, and the second edition in 2015, there is an emphasis in the first edition of the IFLA School Library Guidelines on information literacy. That then becomes part of inquiry in the
Yeah.
2015
Yeah.
second edition. Now,
Yeah.
that isn't the case, certainly in the UK.
So the IFLA School Library Guidelines is an international com association that supports librarians across the world, because so there's so many translations now of the IFLA School Library Guidelines. So this is a international company that are trying to embrace equality of what comes from a school library across the world, really, isn't it? And they do say that within their guidelines, there's going to be local edits to that for your local specific country, I suppose is the right word. So we, as the UK, then we wrote it was SILIP School Library Guidelines wrote them. Were they linked at that point to the IFLA School Library Guidelines? Which came first? Did the IFLA School Library Guidelines come first, or did the SILIP School Library Guidelines come first?
So that is the subject of a whole other session.
Okay.
But yeah, because that is quite a complicated thing, because I've got the first, second, and third edition of the what was the Library Association guidelines that then became the SILIP guidelines. That was for secondary schools.
Right.
And the first edition and the second edition of the IFLA guidelines, and I compared the contents of so the contents and the evolution of.
Okay.
So
So if
I
we're
think
gonna okay, so if we're gonna have a conversation about that in the future, we need to bring this history of on a step then. So we'll come back to the guidelines, but let's talk about the fact that in 1986 we needed somebody somewhere to saying what it is and what school libraries is and does. But as far as I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong, there was no clear voice that said this is what we do and this is how we do it. There seemed to be a few voices going, this is what we could and should do, but you don't have to. And is that where our problems lie? Do you know is there a clear, sections between 86 and now that have made the situation we have now?
So it takes time to piece together school library history, and I think one of the difficulties that we have is I'm not aware of a history. Yes, so I'm not aware of a history of UK school librarianship.
No,
in the
so there's
same
not been
way,
one written. Yeah,
yeah, in
no.
the same way, for example, I mean, I've got two really excellent books on the history of school librarianship in the US.
Right.
Um,
So what we're looking at from our perspective then is what we can see has happened and on the research that you have done so far.
and as far as I can tell, in 1986, school librarianship was on the back foot because you remember the reason why there was this great hope for a new dawn of British school librarianship. The whole reason for that was that attempts at educational reform in the 1960s caused teachers to view what they were doing differently, and as a consequence, to view the potential of the library differently. So to view it beyond recreational terms.
Yeah.
And there were sufficient efforts within school librarianship to, I think, align school librarianship to some extent with those changes. And then I think the educational reform movement runs into difficulties for various reasons, which is partly to do, but not entirely to do, with budget cuts.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is that by 1986, school libraries revert to defining themselves in recreational reading terms.
Okay.
Then in 1986, we're on the back foot. The two reasons for hope that Beswick identifies, we maybe did better on the second one about a multicultural society, but I think that is still in recreational reading terms.
Yeah.
The so we're already peripheral again to teaching and learning. And the very real gains that we made in terms of the microcomputer and the information skills, information literacy skills, the way I think that we went about that leaves that very important thing outside of the learning process.
Yeah.
So we don't integrate that into like Norman Beswick says, into a philosophy of education, a view of education, an approach to education that makes it clear why the library is integral and why, amongst the things that make the library integral, information literacy is a really, really important part of that. And that because we aren't then collaborating. So if we think back to what Douglas Knight said, this collaboration between those who first teach the student to inquire and those in the library who can teach them how to inquire, the process of inquiry, which is what we're collaborating with teachers on, to learn subject content in the process of which we are teaching these and other critical skills systematically and progressively. Because that doesn't happen, where we do step outside of recreational reading, that remains something that is peripheral to what is happening in the classroom. And Norman Beswick's challenge to be helping teachers to think differently about what they're doing in the classroom, because that is our overriding concern, that doesn't happen.
So fundamentally, our problem is the fact that we have never linked ourselves to ourselves to understand what the educational purpose of the school library is as a group of professionals, as far as I see it. Along with that, and need to take us back to the fact that even professional librarians are not taught how to teach this.
No, so yeah.
So there's a problem there. That just so those two things need to change. immediately. We need to be clearly understanding as school librarians our purpose within the educational setting of our schools. And we then need systematic training for school librarians to be able to teach learning through inquiry, which focuses on the portrait of a child. This is huge. And not something that you and I can do, although we do chip away at it. The Great School Libraries campaign came up in, when did it start? 5-6 years ago, to try and change that. So that was a collaboration between the School Library Association and SILIP, SLG and SILIP, to try and change. Why? They have, and they're still going, and they're still fighting, and they're talking in Parliament, and they're doing, there's a new thing come out which I can't quite remember what it is, but they are also chipping away at it. There is a bigger problem, isn't there, that if our people in Parliament cannot understand, then there's something fundamentally wrong in the way we are portraying ourselves, or is it the fact that we don't understand ourselves either? To bring this conversation to a close today, we do have campaigns going. You and I know what fundamentally needs to change. What can we do to bring things forward, or is there no hope? Let's finish on some hope, Daryl.
So when we started the FOSIL group in 19, April 2019, we launched the FOSIL group at Lilac in 2019, and we were both at Lilac in 2019.
Yeah.
And you pretty much strong-armed me into Twitter.
Don't remember that, Daryl. Don't remember that at all.
And yeah, I in my little Twitter, with that pinned tweet,
Yeah.
had put that quotation from Dallas Willard. So reality is what we have to deal with. Success is dealing with reality. That's the only measure of success, is the extent to which we deal with reality. So the reality is that the purpose of education is contested. There are different views on what the purpose of education is. Unfortunately, I think that the view of education that has no need for a school library is gaining in strength.
Yeah.
That is partly to do with the particular government that happens to be in power in a country.
Yeah.
And it's also partly to do, though, I think, with the fact that the proponents of that approach are more effective. So because education is defined in a certain way,
Yeah.
and they are more effective at providing evidence that that approach to education delivers results,
Yeah.
and they are more effective at communicating that, and rallying people to their cause, I think we have a very difficult struggle ahead of us, largely because we aren't clear about what the alternative is. We aren't clear about our role in the alternative.
Yeah.
And we're uncoordinated.
Yes. Okay. So
Yes.
we know that that's a problem. We can see it. Anybody can see it. So what's our advice to anybody listening? How can that individual person that's listening to this podcast now go, okay, I need to do something about this? What can they start doing?
So the very first thing, that's why I mentioned Dallas Willard. So the very first thing is we have to recognize, we have to take account of the reality that we are in, what we have to deal with,
Okay.
with. So we need to recognize that individually.
Okay, so proactive though approaches.
Yes, we have to resolve.
Yes.
So what it boils down to is we need to resolve to become knowledgeable.
Okay.
About.
Yeah, this
and
is the
then
thing.
we need to take practical steps to make ourselves knowledgeable.
Yes. Yes. So it's about learning and learning about education. And actually, let me finish.
And collaborating.
And collaboration. So let me finish this podcast with, if you're listening and you're thinking, yes, you want to be involved and you want to do something and you want to start learning, then your starting place is the FOSIL group website, where there's lots of discussions about how you can move forward and how you can challenge yourself, but also discuss with others about ways forward, I suppose, isn't it? Okay. Enough for today. We hope you have enjoyed listening to our FOSIL podcast. As always, if you'd like to comment on anything you've heard, we'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on future discussions. Thank you for listening.